You may remember Chip Gliedman from our one frame competition last month, sponsored by the Society. He took first place for his excellent one frame exhibit. But tonight, he will be presenting mill routes of Rupert's land and the Red River settlement. So let's hear more about Chip Gliedman.
Chip Gliedman. Chip retired from a 35-year career as a technology analyst and consultant. Like many, he collected stamps as a child and picked them up again in the 1990s. His collecting interests include U.S. postal history, Canadian stamps and covers, GB Imperforate line engraved, and the Britannia issues of 3 British islands. He is a 20-plus year exhibitor with more than a dozen different exhibits that have won every award from bronze to platinum domestically, and gold medals internationally, culminating with the Grand Prix International at Capex 2022 and the highest score for a single frame exhibit at Hybrid 2023. He enjoys stretching the bounds of exhibiting and has been awarded the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors Creativity Award 4 times. Chip is a member of multiple philatelic organizations, including the APS, the Collectors Club of New York, the AAPE, and the Postal History Society of Canada. He is a Fellow of the Royal Philatelic Society London, and a member of the U.S. Philatelic Classics Society, where he is also the section editor for the 1861 period and editor for the next iteration of the American Stampless Cover Catalog.
Fellow members and friends, Chip Gliedman. Chip?
I am going to be talking today about my other one frame exhibit. Let's do this. Let's do this. I put together a little exhibit, and just like most of these things, it all started with one cover. I at one point collected the 12-cent 1861 US issue, and I had this cover in my collection. And didn't know much about it, but if you can see, the manuscript on the left says Fort Garry, 30 October, August 9th, received 19th, answered the 20th or whatever, November. And it got me interested, and I started digging to see if I could learn some more about it. And an entire interesting world opened up to me. Now, being American, I knew nothing about Rupert's land. I still know only what I've managed to piece together. So I am probably going to make numerous historical errors. Please feel free to correct me. Just don't hold it against me. They don't teach us this stuff. So let me see if I can advance this. There we go. So I'm going to talk today about the mail routes of Rupert's land. And I hope you find it as interesting as I have over the last 10 years or so. We can start with a real simple question. Who the heck is Rupert? And why did they name the land after him? Prince Rupert of the Rhine, cousin of English King Charles II. He was released from prison in Germany and ended up in England, where his cousin was. He was a big deal in the Royalist forces during the English wars. And he funded an expedition to British North America in 1667. I think he paid something like 120 pounds to outfit a ship. And they brought back furs that were worth something like 2,000 pounds. And it was a pretty good return on investment. So he was granted a charter over the entire watershed for Hudson's Bay in 1670. And that became the company that was established to take advantage of that charter became the Hudson's Bay Company. And for close to 200 years, they were the de facto government over 2/3 of what's now Canada. I'm just going to close my door so my wife doesn't have to hear this. There we go. Sorry about that. So now that we know who Rupert is, where is Rupert's land? Rupert's land is actually the green area here. It's about 1.5 million square miles, almost 4 million square kilometers. Basically, if you dropped a stick in the river and it flowed towards Hudson's Bay, it was Rupert's land. You can see it dipped down into what's now the United States. It went up above the Arctic Circle. It was a big area. It was basically only exploited for fur trading and trapping. But then a Lord Selkirk of Scotland got a grant in 1811 to establish non-fur trading settlements. So he was offered the ability to offer land to settlers for farming and trading, as long as they did not get into the fur trade. And that Selkirk's grant basically centered around what is now Winnipeg, the Red River Settlement, Fort Garry, and it extended basically down to the southern tip of Rupert's Land. You can see Lake Superior on the right of the map. The 49th parallel cut right across it, just like it cuts right across the boundary. It is the boundary between the US and Canada in that area. And by the way, the fact that they brought in the settlers and that which developed as a result of that probably led to the expansion of the nation of Canada westward and eventually to the Pacific. Without these settlements, there was really no reason to incorporate that area into the country. Looking at just the top half of this map, you can see the 49th parallel going across the top. And you can see Louisiana Purchase, which we got from France. Basically, if you dropped the stick in the river and it flowed down to the Gulf of Mexico, that was Louisiana Purchase. You can see the blue area at the top was part of Rupert's Land, and the green area to the west of it was part of Louisiana Purchase. And we basically made a trade, US and Canada, to draw the line straight across. We got the southern part of Rupert's Land, and they got Canada got the northern part of Louisiana Territory, Louisiana Purchase. Just to add one thing, in 1821, the Northwest Company merged with the Hudson's Bay Company. The Northwest Company was basically French and controlled the area west of Rupert's Land. So with the merger, the Hudson's Bay Company basically controlled everything except the little, Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes. Everything else was really under their control until 1870. Real simple statement. Rupert's Land was in the middle of nowhere. They get the supplies in and the furs out, and what about the mail? Well, as it turns out, they tried a number of different ways to do it. And there ended up being 4 different routes to get mail and supplies in and out of this western half of Canada. And I just broke them down basically into how they were done. And it ended up being fairly chronological. First through Montreal, then through outposts at York Factory and on Hudson Bay. A brief attempt to run mail through Sault Ste. Marie. And then eventually the long established route, or the one that became the easiest and best route, was through Pembina in the Dakota Territory. So let's look at some stuff. The map basically shows the route that this cover on the left took. It was datelined in Scotland in 1822. Was transported on a private ship, probably a Hudson's Bay Company ship, to Montreal. Rated 11.5 pence due at Montreal. And then it was transported across the continent to Fort St. James, which is basically at the Continental Divide, in the Rocky Mountains. It was 2,700 miles from Montreal to Fort James, and they did it basically by putting this letter in a bag in a canoe and paddling west, meeting up with somebody who was paddling east with a canoe with furs, and they would unload the furs and move into one canoe, and they'd take the supplies in the mail and put them in the other canoe, and they'd wave goodbye, and they'd go back in their opposite directions. And they did this for 2,700 miles. And it took about a year for the total transit for this letter to get from Scotland to Fort St. James. And John Stewart, who was the chief factor in charge of New Caledonia, which is which is now British Columbia, basically. If you want to actually trace the actual canoe routes that these people took in moving mail and supplies and furs across the country, there's actually a book that's available online, and it is literally, it's online, and I've studied it and I've looked at it, and it's just amazing. So here's New Caledonia, and Fort St. James is off on a little bit on the right, and how they actually got, from one lake and stream to the other, where the portages were, the different routes they took. So it's an amazing resource, and it is, I said, available online. Fur Trade Canoe Routes of Canada, Then and Now. If you just want to be amazed at some of the gyrations that they went through to get these things, across. A little more on the canoes. They had two different kinds of canoes, a big canoe and a small canoe. Novel. The Montreal canoe and the North canoe, as they were also known. The Montreal canoe was roughly 36 feet, 11 meters long. And you can see on the left, there's a painting by Frances Anne Hopkins, which basically is of one of these Montreal canoes. The North canoe, the small canoe, had a 4 to 6 man crew and roughly 2-ton capacity. It had an 18-inch draft, fully loaded. It had an 18-inch draft, which is just an astounding thing, that you could put 2 tons of supplies and people in a canoe and run it in water that was, half a meter deep. The way they portaged it between streams was different. They carried the Montreal canoe between them upright. The North canoe was portaged upside down. But they would literally have to unload it and carry the supplies, and then carry the canoe and reload the supplies and paddle on again. 2,700 miles. So here's one that was going in the other direction. Didn't go nearly as far. It started at the Red River Settlement, which, remember, settled after 1811 when Lord Selkirk started bringing Scottish predominantly settlers over. But there was also, just across the river from what was known as the Red River Settlement, was Saint Boniface, or however it would be pronounced in French. But it was the sort of the French settlement paired with the English Red River Settlement. And this one went from there to France, to Lyon. July 1838, roughly 100-day transit from Red River Settlement to Montreal, to Quebec, where it was put in the males, 18 3/4 on the lower left, paid, which is the postage to New York, 11 upper right, which was the postage to the Canadian border, stamped in New York and put on the ship and sent over to France, where it was 19 décimes due, one for the décime de mer, the ship letter rate, and 18 for the local delivery. After they were able to start establishing more settlements, they were able to build a network that sort of centered around York Factory and Norway House, coming off of Hudson Bay. The Hudson Bay Company would run supply ships into Hudson's Bay once or twice a year, usually arriving, late spring and leaving before the freeze in September. And sometimes they talked about 2 ships or 2 trips, but generally speaking, 1 or 2 per year. And this network of settlements and outposts and trading posts, including down as far as Ansonia in Oregon, Fort Colville, which is now in state of Washington, Fort St. James, which I mentioned before, Rupert House and Moose River on the Hudson Bay, where everything funneled towards either Norway House or York Factory. And when mail was coming from Europe to these settlements, they would be bundled at the Hudson Bay House in London. And very often they would put at least on the top letter of the stack, they would put a marking. In this case, it says MR for Moose River. So this one came from Scotland, the 1 shilling 2.5, plus the additional half pence for the axle tax, the mailroad tax from Scotland, got it to London, and then it was bagged and sent, routed to the Moose River settlement. There's a picture of some of the ships. And this is being a York boat, which is actually what they use to run mostly between Norway House and York Factory. It is a more substantial boat, oars, rather than paddles. It was able to go faster and carry more loads. But still, you can imagine what it took to move across Canada in craft such as this. Another one, this one went from Fort Colville, the left blue arrow, to York Factory. Fort Colville is now in Washington State. It went 1,800 miles in 186 days. So you can do the math, roughly 10 miles a day. Datelined April, received October. The entire summer. A couple more that came through. Both of these have RR for Red River. There's RRS, Red River Settlement markings. They don't all have it. The presumption is it was the top one in a stack of envelopes that was marked with these types of initials. The one on the right, actually, when I acquired the cover, it did not have the penny black on it, but it actually did originally, when it was mailed in Scotland, have a penny black on it. And I carried a little template around with me for about 2 years looking at penny blacks, till I found one that had the red Maltese cross in the right position so that I could hinge the penny black onto it and, at least make it look like it did when it left the sender's hand in Scotland. But sometime in the course of that journey, or the course of the 160 years since, somebody pulled the penny black off of it. And so it's marked in the exhibit that the black is a replacement. But it was a single letter sent from Scotland to London and then readdressed to Red River Settlement, Hudson's Bay, as was the one on the left. Reverend Smithhurst. You may see that both of these are to Reverend Smithhurst. there's actually a very large correspondence, the Smithhurst correspondence, that came out some years ago. Bill Longley actually managed and brokered many of the sales of Smithhurst letters. Another one, this one has the YF on the top right, the same 1 shilling 2.5, forwarded to Fort Severn, approximately 300 kilometers southeast of York Factory. So just sort of a recap of some of the markings. Couple others. Rupert's house. Is Dateline Rupert's house. These are letters that are eastbound from these various outposts to London. Most of them entered the mail in Deal, as you can say, as Deal ship letters, or Liverpool ship letters, and that's why it's 1 shilling 4, the distance from Deal to London. 1831, 1838. The Canadian government wanted to get in on everything and wanted to begin to handle the mail delivery, and mostly because they were worried about communications and things happening behind their back. So they tried to establish a mail route through Sault Ste. Marie and Fort William on Lake Superior. But it was very hard to provision and very hard, to actually do that route. So it did not last very long, but there are a number of postal artifacts that did traverse that route. The top left one passed through Detroit and has the wonderful inscription on the lower left, to the care of the agent of the Honorable Hudson's Bay Company at the Sault Ste. Marie and Detroit, forwarded by Sandwich in Detroit. The postmaster in Detroit are respectfully requested to forward this letter to Lake Superior. So someone put it in the mail in Massa and went through Detroit. It was then routed up to Sault Ste. Marie and handed over to the Canadian postal authorities there. Sent postage collect from Sault Ste. Marie to Red River Settlement. A few others. The one on the right actually has a Sault Ste. Marie date stamp from 1854. It's part of the Ross correspondence. James Ross was the postmaster at Red River Settlement for many years and sent letters to his son who was studying in Toronto in college. This one ended up being routed through Sault Ste. Marie, and where it was marked due 3 for Canadian postage to Montreal to Toronto. In 1850, the U.S. opened a post office in Pembina, which is 68 miles south of Winnipeg, Red River Settlement. And the settlers there took advantage of this, starting a monthly courier service, which then actually became a bi-weekly courier service, running, ox cart trains through Pembina onto St. Paul. But the post office in Pembina is where they actually could post letters. So they would be handed over to Ross, the postmaster in Red River Settlement, a 3 pence, which was later reduced to 1 pence per letter charge for the courier service to Pembina was paid there. And then they entered the mails, generally speaking, postage collect in Pembina. Because remember, these are going back to Canada, so they were international mail. And while domestic mail in the US had to be prepaid. You did not have to necessarily prepay international mail. So these ox carts, this is a line drawing I found someplace of a Red River ox cart. The wheels were roughly 5-6 feet high. They could carry 1,000 pounds. There was no metal whatsoever in this. So they could be built and repaired anywhere. You did not need to have forges or blacksmiths or anything. It was entirely made of wood. And they would have ox cart trains of up to 600 traveling from Winnipeg down to St. Paul. And a month ago, I was down in Washington, D.C., and went to the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And lo and behold, they have an ox cart. And it was just amazing to see it in person. That basically this cart, which I'm sure dates from something in the 19th century, was one of the ox carts that plied the route from Red River Settlement to St. Paul. And it's true, there really is no metal in it. Now that I'm looking at it, it might be the hub around that wheel might have some metal on it now. But in theory, they did not have any metal in these. And you can see even the spokes of the wheels are put on and pegged in place. It was big, and there's a little beaver frame there in the front. Pembina, once it was established, a lot of mail traveled through Pembina. It was a 10-cent treaty rate. If you wanted to pay it in Red River Settlement, it would be forwarded with the courier and marked paid 10, and then it would enter the mail in Pembina, prepaid. So you see the one on the left, it says paid 10 cents. The courier actually paid that 10 cents to the postmaster in Pembina, who wrote and date stamped it 1855. For a period of time, Ross used what's been termed a shot glass postmark, probably tracing around it with a pen and then writing Red River BNA and the date in the middle. There are 9 of them recorded. I do have a census of them. I know their history and where they are. Numbers range from 9 to 11, but I've found the number of duplicates, and I believe there are 9 examples. This is the last cover to enter the collection, since it's probably going to get retired. It's interesting in the fact that it says Pembina, Minnesota, for the postmark. So the paid and the paid 24 were applied in Red River Settlement. And then it was couriered down to Pembina, where that date stamp was applied in 1862. Well, there's a problem. There was no Pembina, Minnesota in 1862. Pembina was originally in the Minnesota Territory. Then when Minnesota became a state, what was left of the Minnesota Territory was known as the Unorganized Territory. Then that formalized itself into Dakota Territory in 1861. And so by 1862, when they were still using a Pembina, Minnesota Territory postmark, it wasn't necessarily accurate. There are 5 examples of this. This letter went through the Detroit Exchange Office and ended up in London. A few more Pembina examples going the other direction. The top left one came from Scotland. If you address the mail properly, it would be treated as a letter to the U.S. It was supposed to have been addressed care of Hudson Bay Company, Pembina. If you addressed it St. Paul, well, then it would stop in St. Paul. And for them to get it to Pembina, they'd have to forward it. So even though they knew where it was going, they got to tack 5 cents forwarding for domestic unpaid postage onto the top. So 24 cents from Great Britain to the US, standard treaty rate, plus 5 cents. So you see bottom left, it says 29. The 19 represents the credit to the United States for the transit and the postage, domestic postage. The one on the right came from Toronto. It's the earliest of the 4 decimal period stamped covers to Red River Settlement. This one, they were nice. They marked it missent and kept sending it on its way rather than charging it the extra postage. But it too was Red River Settlement, St. Paul. But then they write Pembina. So it stopped in St. Paul and they wrote missent and then saw it said Pembina and sent it on its way. And then the one on the left and the one on the bottom is something of a mystery cover because we can't figure out what the 44 cents is. And the best I can come up with is that it's the top letter of a bundle and it represents the courier charges. There was no 22-cent rate, 44-cent rate, 11, or any other multiple of 44 anywhere near France, the US, Canada. So the best guess is it was the top one of a pile of letters that were, 1 penny, which was 2 cents. So 22 letters in that stack, which is about what you would expect from one delivery, represents that. But it came from France to Red River Settlement. Let's see what happens when I do this. A few fun things, if you call them that. There was not easy to even go 68 miles from Pembina to Red River Settlement or to go from Pembina to St. Paul. Weather, wars interrupted the mail and the flow of supplies. Most notably, the Dakota Wars of 1862 interrupted mail for 2 months. Some amazing stories that come out of that. Just as has happened many times in our history, we gave the Native Americans the shaft on a number of things and didn't pay them what was due to them. And then the trading posts decided not to extend credit to the Native Americans. And when asked, what will they eat? The person running the trading post is reported to have said, well, they can eat grass. A few days later, he and his brother or son were found dead with their mouths stuffed with grass. Fitting, I thought. But it ended up being a horrific situation for everybody involved. As what they are, the United States, ran over the Native Americans, sentenced 303 of them to death. Many of those tribunals lasted 5 minutes or less. Lincoln commuted 265 of those sentences, but 38 people were summarily executed simultaneously on December 26, 1862 at Mankato, Minnesota. I'm bringing this up just because the article on the right is actually from the Nor'Wester. And if you're in the mood, you can go back and look at what was actually reported in the newspapers. The local newspaper, which in addition to reporting, world events by getting newspapers in and reprinting the stories, wrote up the local stories. University of Manitoba has the entire run of the Nor'Wester online. You can search for any term you want. I was able to find that the earliest, advertisement for envelopes stamped with U.S. postage was an ad in the Nor'Wester. So if you want to know about goings on the frontier, in the 1850s and 1860s, you can just go right to the newspapers. And as I said, it's the University of Manitoba website, library, digital collection. Highly recommended, just because you don't get to see this stuff that often. And it's amazing what's now available on. So these are, as I said, there were stamped envelopes for sale. Ross being the postmaster, Ross and Caldwell had a stationery and dry goods store. But you could buy U.S. postage stamps in Winnipeg at Fort Garry, at Red River Settlement, just like you could in Vancouver, and just like you could in some of the cities in the East. So here are 3 examples. All of them were sent at the 6 cent per half ounce rate, which was the treaty rate between the U.S. and, remember, they entered the mail in the U.S., so they were carried by courier, 1 cent to do that, stamped when they entered the post office in Pembina, and then sent back to Canada. Fun story there. There was actually the first report of the Riel uprising from the soldiers who reached Fort Garry, was actually sent back to the east by way of the U.S. postal system. So even the Canadian military ended up using that same route. But it was 6 cents per half ounce. 3 different ways to pay it: 2 3-cent 1869 grilled stamps, 2 3-cent, 3 2-cent, and then the 12 cent, which is the one that started all this, was a double rate larger envelope, 1 ounce. In 1870, 1869, the Canadian government figured that they better get a handle on all of this, and basically bought Ruperts land from Hudson's Bay Company. I don't think Hudson's Bay Company had a whole lot of choice in whether they sold or not. But then they were, with the Manitoba Act, established Manitoba as a province in 1870. And at that point, it was, a province of Canada, so you could send mail from one province of Canada to another for at first 6 cents, and then the standard 3 cent rate. It was just a 3 cent domestic envelope from Winnipeg to wherever. So there was a very, as I said, very brief period, July to October, where it was 6 cents. And there's only 1 stamped cover at the 6 cent rate during that period. And then, as you can see now, Fort Garry, Manitoba, 1872, 3 cent stamp, regular domestic postage. However, they routed them through the U.S. Still was easier to put it in a closed bag at Fort Garry, hand it off, send it around, wait till it got either to Windsor or to Niagara, and then reopen it and put it back in the mail system. But after 1870, there are no more U.S. markings on any of these covers, even though they did, in fact, traverse the United States. So when I was growing up, I had this stamp in my album. And I grew up basically in a suburb of New York. And all I knew from, moving across these areas was what I saw like on Bonanza. And there was nothing that looked like this on Bonanza. And honestly, I had no idea what was on this stamp. It just, big cow, guy with a stick, a wheel, and the smallest train wagon I'd ever seen in my life. Didn't mean anything. Finally, about 50 years later, it all is beginning to make sense to me. That this is the Red River ox cart that, in essence, opened up, the trade into the middle of Canada The trade in the middle of Canada established Manitoba as the province. The fur trade and the communication routes that were established by the Hudson's Bay Company and then by the settlers to support this network going on in essence, what was the western, 80% of what's now Canada was probably the thing that actually kicked it over from just being a random colonial enterprise to turning it into a nation. So it's a fascinating story. I wish I had known it earlier than I did. And I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned something from some of the things I said tonight. So I do, as I said, the exhibit is up. It has done very well when I've shown it, to the point where I think I have to retire it. I do hope to be able to write a monograph or whatever, talking about all of this, but I don't know that it'll be out there very much. And maybe one of these years, you'll all find one of these covers in your own collection. So I hope you liked it. Feel free to correct anything I said or comments or questions, and I'll do my very best. So thank you.
Well, I'll be the first to comment. That was amazing. I saw your exhibit at CAPEX. In fact, I met you there because I was standing in the hall talking about your exhibit to someone else, and you overheard me and came over to say hello. I really enjoyed that. I don't know how you figured out that it was Red River from some of those covers by the looks of them.
Mostly from the names on the inside, you knew the people, or the date line might say Fort Coville, or the date line on it would say, Moose River. That's the only way you would know, because there were no markings on the outbound covers.
Right.
They would basically be handed person to person to the Hudson Bay Company and enter and deal. So until you opened it up, you did not know where it came from.
So you went and inspected everyone before you purchased it and opened it up and figured it out, or?
Oh, generally speaking, the auction company did that for me.
Ah, okay.
But yes, that's where that information generally comes from. I see one hand up.
Yeah, Chip. I was curious. I remember learning about American history in elementary school. We all do here in Canada to a certain extent. And I remember hearing about the Civil War, but the Dakota War was never once mentioned. So I learned something new about it. But I mean, the concurrence of times, 1862, the Civil War was already on. Was there any connection between the Civil War and the Dakota War?
Not directly. No, these were the Indian Wars. We had all kinds of wars going on. We had the Mormon Wars out in Utah, which actually were no wars. But we did have forts out in Utah to protect the U.S. from the Mormons. But this was basically the westward expansion, which was the 40s, 50s, and 60s, encroached on these native lands. All of Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma.
Right.
The Trail of Tears, where they basically took everyone from Mississippi and Alabama and then moved them to Oklahoma. And then they decided they wanted to take that land and raise cattle on it. So there were always a lot of these things going on all over the place. General Custer was a Civil War figure and then ended up meeting his demise out on the plains, trying to control the Native American uprisings. These were all going on. They were not they were not tied to the Civil War, but they were concurrent with it. There were a lot of, there was Fort Randall, which is in the northeast corner of South Dakota and North Dakota. That corner was established there for the same thing. And if you read these newspaper articles, you'll see, the settlers running to the fort because of the uprising and such. So you probably learned more about U.S. history than I did. And you probably learned I know for a fact you learn more about US history than I learned about Canadian history. So as I said, there's just, it's amazing what's out there. And what they don't teach. You know, they can't teach it all, but it's amazing what you can learn when you start looking.
Yeah, well, thank you for this show. I mean, I did see your exhibit at CAPEX, but I mean, this talk and the eye candy of those amazing historical covers, and you know, I really appreciated that you did the maps. The maps really helped the story. Thank you so much for doing that. That was wonderful.
And as I said, I'm just glad to share it because I found it fascinating, and I'm glad other people did also. So I think I left him speechless here. Andrew, is it up to you? You take it back or whatever?
No, there's surely a few more questions. Questions prompt other questions. So you may be there for a while, Chip.
Okay.
A lot of the early covers were sheets, so there's writing inside and that sort of thing. And I'm sure when you do your monogram, you'll have some interesting thoughts going on. I was just curious, you know, the people who were doing the rowing and that sort of thing, they must have been tough little buggers and probably have very short lifespans. Any idea on the type of people that were doing that and what became of them? You know, they did the thing, but we hardly ever hear about them.
I will butcher it, but I believe they were known as voyageurs.
Say why we?
And there's that. Hopefully that's close enough so you can look it up and find out. But apparently, I don't remember where I read it, but somebody had said something like, you know, give me like 20 of these people and I will take on any army or something like that.
Many of them were from the Orkney Islands in Scotland. No.
Keep going.
And many of them were from Quebec, the place where I'm from, where you know, we know about the voyageurs. They weren't very tall. A lot of them weren't more than an inch or two above 5 feet, but they must have been tough like heck.
Oh, and just the portaging and moving the gear, and then rowing, and then carrying, and then rowing, and paddling, and just it was not easy work. And
I remember a story about someone from a British general bringing a bunch of voyageurs to Europe during a war to help them with transportation of supplies. I can't remember if it was Kipling or someone else.
There was a bunch
A
of
lot
them.
of voyageurs in the wars in Central Africa.
Yeah. There's a place in Ontario called Khartoum on the Madawaska River area, and apparently the region is called Khartoum. Was basically there was a lot of the rivermen from that area had been sent to the Nile during these African expeditions, etc. Now, I never thought of the Nile as being the same as the Madawaska River, but I guess one river is the same as the other one, except one has waterfalls and one doesn't. So,
It was Lord Kitchener who used the voyageur to help rescue Khartoum, but they were too late.
And it was Kitchener that he hired. I'm going to say a lieutenant, maybe he was a captain, major, whatever. But Piercy from Quebec, and he was the one that built the railroad from the Egyptian border to this town, and he eventually got knighted for what he had done there. And that was 20 years after Khartoum had been taken by, and Gordon was killed. But then Kitchener won because of this Canadian engineer who helped build that railroad.
The other thing that hit me, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, there was a large contingent of voyageurs from the Selkirk area in Manitoba some of the tribes are one of the Indian tribes in that area supplied a lot of the Nile voyageurs. So they're mostly from Quebec, but some from Manitoba.
No, that the book is available online. You can download it as a PDF. So have it, you know, you can bring it with you when you're out there.
You're chickening out there, Chip. One thing that hit me too is that, you know, that's a huge area to be able to say, okay, we start over here and then we go down this river, we jump over this lake, we go down this stream, then go left over here. The exploration that must have happened ahead of time, talking to probably the natives and that sort of thing. Well, we want to go over to whatever that place. You gotten into any of that, how these routes were established?
I haven't. I would recommend that book and see what they say. A lot of this had to do with these were basically these are the portages from this river to that one. So there were really spaces where they didn't have to go over a huge mountain or something like that. But remember, they're going one way and somebody else is coming the other way. So they both had to be on the same path. Or else they just would have passed a mile apart and then never seen each other. So there had to have been a lot of coordination. You may not have known when you were going to run into that person, but you had to know that if you kept going this way, somebody was eventually going to keep going in the other direction.
Right. Interesting.
Gilles, I see your hand.
Chip, I got a couple of questions. First, I really appreciate the presentation. I spent a lot of time just reading your presentation at CAPEX in 2022. It was great, but I learned a lot more today because, you know, it's more readable than standing in front and trying to decipher everything. But one thing that caught my attention is that the maps that you have there, for example, somebody mentioned that. It shows also other route, like coming from what is now Churchill, which was, I think, not Fort Nelson, but from the Hudson Bay, then going to Moosonee, going to Fort Rupert. Did you ever, in preparing for this exhibit, did you ever encounter any communication or any correspondence on that part? From Moosonee, for example, Fort Garry to Moosonee to Fort Rupert?
Not that I can remember. You know, basically you see most of what it is that I've managed to find. There's roughly, as far as I can tell, there's roughly 300 or 400 covers from this entire area. Now, many of them are fairly nondescript, you know, bland covers from the Smithhurst correspondence. But, you know, there may have been buried in there something, but one of the covers is, has something in the inside that says, the Indian arrived from Rupert, house today. And he's going back tomorrow. And so I pen you this letter. I haven't gone far enough into so many of those, really ugly covers to know exactly where they came from or where they were going.
So I guess from what I hear, there was probably not a main route from Fort Garry, for example, from Red River Settlement to the north, for example, because the ship used to come on the northeast of the settlement, but it was mostly for the goods coming in, not for correspondence going out.
Yeah, everything basically went through either York Factory on the bay, which was the port, which is where the ships were loaded and unloaded, or Norway House, which was the place where everything sort of came together, or Red River Settlement, which was the population center. And so, all of the things I've been able to find have been sort of funneled in those directions. There may have been a route that came down from the north. I just haven't encountered anything from it, so I did not pursue what it might be or where it might be.
But again, thanks for an outstanding presentation and great material.
Mhm.
Thank
Are
you.
there any archives where there may be covers such as the Hudson's Bay Company or predecessor, can't say that word, PDS companies that came before them in England or whatever?
Well, the two companies were the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. And I believe there are archives of the Hudson's Bay Company. I haven't really looked at them or looked for them, just because I have short attention span. And and you end up having to like focus yourself on what am I trying to find out. You know, and then actually, honestly, there was enough in the Nor'wester. There were reports of how many letters were sent in various different years. That was enough for me to, you know, to do things like that. But if I really needed to find, you know, how many furs, I know that there are records of how many furs came out of, you know, various different areas of the US and Canada in various different years. But I was looking at the mail and not the furs. And they were looking at the furs and not the mail. The mail was really a side note for them that they kind of sent it along. And you still had to be friends with somebody. They had to not believe that you were trying to undercut them and using the mail to you know, plot something around them. So it was.
Well, Chip, all the furs are gone, but the mail is still there.
Mhm.
The beaver,
Chip, so Chip, could we get the name of that website again? I really like the maps. I want to be able to go see the maps.
well, my web. Let me just. I'll give you more websites than you want.
No, just the one that was in your at the end of your presentation.
Yeah, that's my website, redriver.cgpostal.com.
There it is. Yeah, redriver.cgpostal.com. Okay, thanks. redriver.cgpostal.com. Yep.
Okay, now all of the maps I use, I get from the David Rumsey archive at Stanford University. And if you go to davidrumsey.com, you will find an amazing archive of maps. And so this is actually a map of North, it says map of North America. I put the green line on it, but it was shaded with the green on the inside. But this is an 1860-ish, 1850. I can't read the number on the bottom right. Ordered by the House of Commons to be printed 12 July 1850.
Yeah.
So this is an 1850 map. And obviously, if I'm talking about this period of time, I like having, you know, 1850 maps.
Absolutely. I mean, I think so many of us are learning tonight from the maps, stuff that we never knew, really.
Yeah,
I agree with Ingo and Jill. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Terrific.
So and then basically I took that map and I laid the red lines and the text over it.
Thank you.
Which I did describe one day in the AAPE journal, and I think Pat Walker's on the phone, and so yeah, so I actually wrote down how I actually do these maps. But it's you know, I start with that as the archive, but it's great seeing what they, you know, where the actual, you know, settlements were in 1850, what was on the map at that time. And you know, you can see there's not a lot on the map in 1850.
No, yeah.
What was that site where you found a map again?
davidrumsey.com. Oh, now you're making me look.
Yep, that's it. I got it.
Okay. There you go.
I have a comment and a question for you.
Sure.
The Hudson Bay archives are in Winnipeg, and they're in a museum because I've contacted them for Muskogee information from the 1930s. So that's, if you want to ever go to Winnipeg, you can visit them. It's very nice there in February and March, by the way. And
I have
second,
been, by the way, I have been to Winnipeg, and Fort Garry is a park right in downtown.
oh, really?
Yes, it is. There's not much fort there, but there is. I had a business meeting in the building right next to that. But that is where Fort Garry was. It's right in downtown Winnipeg.
I want to get there one day to visit the archives myself. And second, have you ever worked out what in today's prices those letters would cost?
There actually is another website, eh.net, I think is what it is. But it's what's it worth? So you can actually figure out the exchange rate. It mostly does US then to US now using a number of different calculators. And then so you could just do the exchange rate. It was basically 2 to 1. Or British was, 24 cents to 1 shilling, 24 cents US, 1 shilling Great Britain. But there's a number of different ways. What was the average daily wage? So 24 cents would have been 1 whatever of a daily wage. Then it's now 1 whatever of a daily wage now. And that would be one way to calculate it. Another way would just be the inflation rate, buying power. So there's a number of different calculators that people can use. I don't want to get into economic theory and say what's right. The economists used to use what they used to use as the Big Mac index, because it was the one product that was available in basically every city on earth. So they could compare cost of living between any two cities by comparing the cost of Big Macs. It was called the Big Mac index. So there's all kinds of different ways to figure it out. But you can figure, remember it's going up and down. So it costs 12 cents to mail a letter. It costs 6 cents, then it costs 3, then it costs 6. Now it costs $1.50. So it's hard to say, exactly what you're getting for the buying power, but there are a number of different economic calculators.
Yeah, if you Google historical exchange rates, I did that once for one of my Hong Kong exhibits to find out what the Hong Kong dollar was worth in the whatever date I was researching. I think that ECH website that you mentioned is the one that I use. There's a bunch of them. And you're right, the comparison is difficult because you got to take a lot more into account than just the actual exchange rate. But just Google historical exchange rates and you'll find a bunch of information there.
See, it's a wide-ranging conversation. This is what happens. You start with one cover and you end up talking about the exchange rate between the Hong Kong dollar and the Canadian dollar.
And the Big Mac index, which is still being calculated by the economist in England.
Yes. But it's true. If you want to figure out the, relative cost of living in one city versus another,
it's the best
what's
index.
a Big Mac cost?
Yeah, it's the best index around.
In 1994, I did a trip all through Europe, and every city I went to, I stopped at McDonald's and had a quarter pounder just to compare the taste and price. So I know what they mean.
Yeah.
Just as a curiosity, Chip, Red River Settlement used to be called also the La Rivière Rouge. And, this was at the time of founding of Manitoba. This was quite a large population of French people living there, mostly populating the northwest part of Canada at the time. In your research, did you ever came across any correspondence in French, or was it all in English?
Yes, and then in fact, so it's funny. I mean, I used a lot of words sort of interchangeably, but there was, a number of settlements. The Red River settlement was one place. Fort Garry was the actual fort. Across the river was St. Boniface, which was the French settlement. And then just upstream was Indian settlement. And then further up was another one, I think called Carroll Gardens or something like that. And I only know about that one because there was a cover that Siegel had up for auction from the Dubois collection that they said it was from one place. And I said, no, it's not. It's actually called this because it wasn't like colored gardens. It was Carroll Gardens or vice versa. And so there were a lot of these little places like that. The entire west of Canada was the Northwest Company. Basically, Hudson's Bay Company had Rupert land, Northwest Company had everything else.
Yeah.
With the merger, Hudson's Bay Company took over management of the whole thing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the other fort there, I think, was called Fort Gibraltar, which is in Saint Boniface, just about 1 kilometer from Fort Garry.
Mm-hmm. Let me go back to that. Let me see if I can.
Recently.
Let me pull up that Selkirk map, maybe because there were a lot of places on that. Okay, let me see if I can share this one. Okay, so I should be showing this one. So this is the map of the quote unquote Selkirk grant.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah.
And you can see, Fort Pembina, that would, so basically that's below, that's now in the US. But you can see the at least some of the posts that were basically, so if you figure it as being 68 miles from Pembina to Fort Garry, you're basically looking, at something that's roughly, the same distance to the west, and then another of the same distance past that. So maybe 150 miles from Fort Garry to the border on the left. But it gives you an idea of at least some of the place names at the time. Old Fort in Pembina was 1788. Go to the David Rumsey website. You don't know what you might dig up.
Yeah, definitely will go. Yeah.
80 miles to the inch. That's pretty close. 1817. So that was the 1817 map. That was before all the settlement, basically. That was there when Selkirk got there. So Norway House, which was at the time called Jack River House, on the north end of Lake Winnipeg. Cumberland House. Those are all trading posts.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the map, the lakes don't quite look like they look today. Winnipegosis, especially the one to the left there, is parts missing.
And so again, if you want somebody who's actually been on that route, I would point you back to this one. So if nothing else, if I can share my sources with you, I think that's probably the best thing I can do on this kind of presentation, because I can't foresee what you're going to need from the, or want. But the Rumsey is a great site. David Rumsey, the eh.net's a great site. This was a great site. The Nor'Wester site was terrific. And if I can help you to find something there that would help you out, I feel like I've done something good. So thank you. Okay, can I go now?
Well, on behalf of the PSSC, Chip, I want to thank you for a fabulous presentation and a walk through early history of Canada and part of the States too. I encourage you to continue your interest in this. You talked about doing some sort of publication on it, and I'm sure once that is available, we'll all be quite interested to see that. So thank you very much for your presentation tonight on behalf of the PSSC.